Ethan Blake had never been one for heroics. He wasn't the type to charge into a battle or to take a bullet for anyone, no matter how heroic the cause. But that was before the stars aligned, and before the Claw invaded. It all began on a Tuesday, a day so ordinary it felt like any other. The smell of coffee, the hum of traffic, the quiet buzz of his office computer, it was the calm before the storm. Ethan had just clicked send on an email when the sky cracked open. The first explosion ripped through the city. A violent, thunderous sound that shook the windows and sent a jolt of terror through his veins. Ethan leapt from his seat, heart pounding as the second and third blasts followed in rapid succession. People screamed in the hallways. A flash of light flared outside his office, and he caught a glimpse of something in the sky, something massive, something alien. "Is it?" someone whispered behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who spoke. It was Julie, his coworker, her voice trembling. She was always the first to panic. Ethan didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the chaos unfolding outside. The street was ablaze, smoke billowing into the sky. The alien ships, dozens of them, swooped in like vultures over a dying carcass. Their sleek, dark forms glinted menacingly in the light. A low hum filled the air, followed by the shrieking sound of something tearing through the atmosphere. He had to move. His mind raced as he grabbed his jacket and darted for the door. Julie hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but he wasn't waiting around. He wasn't going to be the one to die first. He could already hear the sirens in the distance, and if he knew anything about chaos, it was that survival was about getting out of the city, fast. "Julie, come on," he shouted over his shoulder. She followed, her breath shallow, but there was no time for hesitation. The city was falling apart around them. They pushed through the back stairwell and into the alleyway, where the stench of burning fuel and debris filled the air. As they reached the main road, Ethan froze. A Claw soldier stood in front of them, its spindly limbs tall and impossibly long, ending in sharp talons. Its skin was like a reflective oil slick, and its eyes, glowing an unsettling shade of red, studied them with cold, calculating intensity. Julie gasped beside him, but Ethan's body didn't move. He wasn't sure what to do. A part of him wanted to run, but another part of him was locked in place, paralyzed by the reality of the alien before them. "Move," he shouted. He didn't know where the words came from, but instinct kicked in, and his legs followed, shoving Julie out of the way as he darted into a nearby alley. The Claw moved with unnatural speed, leaping effortlessly into the path they'd just vacated. It wasn't after them yet, but it didn't need to be. It was merely observing, calculating. "Ethan," Julie's voice shook, barely a whisper. He turned to her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. She looked terrified, her eyes wide, but there was something else there, a sense of realization, a question she was too afraid to ask. "What's happening?" she breathed. He shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to keep moving." He motioned for her to follow, but Julie stayed rooted to the spot, eyes still locked on the Claw soldier in the distance. Ethan grabbed her arm, more forcefully than he intended. "We don't have time for this." At that moment, another ship, larger, more formidable, came into view, its silhouette blocking the sun. It hovered above the streets, casting a long shadow that stretched across the entire city. And from its belly, a hatch opened, releasing more soldiers, their forms descending to the ground like a nightmare made real. Ethan's stomach clenched. This wasn't just an invasion. This was an eradication. The Claw weren't here to negotiate or coexist. They were here to conquer. "Julie," Ethan said, his voice low but firm. "You're coming with me. We're getting out of here." She finally nodded, the fight leaving her body as she followed him into the maze of alleys and side streets. As they ran, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets, Ethan felt the weight of it all settle heavily on his shoulders. They weren't just surviving this attack, they were witnessing humanity's last stand. A stand against an enemy that knew no mercy. And then, just as they rounded a corner, a voice cut through the air, unmistakable and chilling. "Human. We know you are here." Ethan froze. His breath caught in his throat. "We know you are the one who survived the blast," the voice continued, deeper now. "You cannot hide. You cannot escape." He turned slowly, looking over his shoulder toward the edge of the street. There, in the shadows, stood something much larger. Something much worse. The real enemy. The one who had declared war on humanity. And Ethan realized, with sickening clarity, the world he knew was gone. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest as Kira's words settled in the air, hanging between them like a heavy fog. "You're the key." The echo of those words reverberated through his mind, but he couldn't focus on them, not with the ground shaking beneath his boots and the growl of something enormous just beyond the trees. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered to himself, his voice a ragged whisper that barely carried over the crashing sounds of something large moving through the underbrush. Kira's eyes flashed with urgency. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the strap of his jacket as she yanked him toward the trees. "We don't have time. They're here." The words barely registered before Ethan heard it, a piercing screech that echoed through the forest like a predator announcing its arrival. His spine went rigid, and his heart pounded harder in his chest. "Who are they?" His voice was thick with confusion, the question stumbling out despite his best efforts to remain calm. "They're hunters," Kira replied, her gaze scanning the shadows around them, alert and poised. Her posture was rigid, like an animal sensing danger. "And we're the prey." The words struck him like a blow, his brain struggling to process them. A mechanic from a small town on Earth wasn't prepared to fight some alien hunters. He wasn't prepared for anything beyond broken engines and car parts. But then again, he hadn't expected to meet an alien woman stranded in the middle of the forest, either. "What do you mean?" Ethan's voice cracked as the first shape emerged from the trees, a massive silhouette, its outline shifting as it moved, bending unnaturally like a shadow made flesh. "They're tracking us." Kira's voice was tight, the fear she had tried to hide now unmistakable. "And you're their target." The creature's glowing eyes flickered in the dark, scanning the area with eerie precision. It was humanoid, tall, its body wrapped in strange, metallic armor that glimmered in the moonlight. Ethan froze, his stomach turning. This wasn't something from a movie or a video game. This was real. This was happening. I can't fight that," he stammered, his hands trembling as he took a step back. The image of the creature's sharp claws and unnatural movements made him want to run. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but Kira's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist in a vice-like grip. "You don't have a choice." Her voice was calm but intense. "You think they'll stop with just me?" Ethan's breath came in shallow gasps, and his mind raced, searching for any kind of explanation. "You're saying I have to fight them?" Kira's lips curled into a tense, determined smile. "Not fight. Survive." She turned away, her eyes locking on the moving shadows in the distance. "We need to move. Now." Ethan didn't argue. His instincts kicked in, and without thinking, he followed her through the trees. His feet slapped against the wet earth, the sound of his boots lost in the growing cacophony of footsteps and screeches closing in from all sides. The creatures were relentless, each one pushing forward with unnerving speed. As they darted between the trees, Kira glanced over her shoulder. "You've heard of the aliens that visit Earth, right? The ones with their ships and technology?" Ethan nodded, his breath coming in uneven bursts. "Yeah, but I never thought." "That's because most of them are peaceful," Kira interrupted. "But there's a faction out there that hunts for sport. And you're the last thing they expected." Ethan blinked, trying to process her words. "Me? I don't even know what's going on. I don't. I'm just a mechanic." "You're more than that," Kira said, her voice full of conviction. "They didn't know Earth had the kind of resilience you do. And that's why they're after you." Ethan's mind raced, but the sound of the creature's movements, quick and ominous, drowned out all other thoughts. He pushed forward, his hands brushing against tree bark as he followed Kira deeper into the forest. The air around them grew thick, the trees towering like silent witnesses to their desperate flight. Every rustle in the leaves, every snap of a twig beneath their feet seemed amplified, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, there was a sudden movement, a blur in the shadows. Ethan barely had time to react before Kira pulled him down, yanking him behind a thick oak tree just as one of the creatures charged past them. Its sleek, metallic form glinted in the moonlight, and its claws scraped the earth with each step. The air felt charged, electric, as if the very space around them was alive with the presence of danger. Kira's breath was steady, but her eyes were wild with focus. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "They can hear everything." Ethan's chest tightened as he crouched, his heart hammering in his ears. He'd never been more afraid in his life. The creatures were relentless, and Kira was right, he was their target. He was the prey. Suddenly, the weight of her words hit him again. "You're the key." What did that mean? What was so special about him? The realization sent a chill down his spine. He had no answers, only questions, and the horrifying certainty that there was no turning back now. Behind him, the tree shifted again, and he turned, his pulse spiking. But Kira was already moving, pulling him forward. He didn't know what he was getting into, but there was one thing he did know: they weren't safe yet. And with every step, he could feel the weight of that truth pressing down on him. The hunt had only just begun. Ethan's lungs burned as they ran. His body, unaccustomed to this kind of pace, screamed for relief, but the urgency in Kira's eyes kept him moving. The hunt wasn't just a metaphor, it was a reality. The creatures were closing in, their alien senses trained to detect even the slightest movement. "Stay low," Kira hissed, her voice urgent. She pulled him to the ground behind a thick underbrush, pressing her finger to her lips. He didn't question it. The growl of something large and feral sounded too close, and instinct took over. They crouched in the dark, the cold air wrapping around them, thick with the smell of wet earth and fear. Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but Kira was unshaken, her eyes narrowing as she listened for any sign of movement. He couldn't help but wonder what she knew, what had happened to her that made her so calm in the face of death. Her skin, pale under the faint moonlight, was slick with sweat, but there was no tremor in her hands. She was focused, composed, and completely in control. "What are they?" Ethan finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "And why are they after us?" Kira didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the shadows, where the creature's footsteps had grown louder. They were hunting, methodical in their approach. She exhaled slowly, as if weighing the cost of revealing the truth. "They're called the Claw," she said softly, almost to herself. "A warrior race. The worst kind of predators." "Predators?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "Like, the kind that eat you?" "Worse." Kira's lips tightened into a thin line. "They don't just kill for food. They hunt for sport, and they're exceptionally good at it. They've been tracking me for days." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "But why me? I'm just a guy. I don't know anything about, well, any of this. I can barely get my truck to start half the time." Kira's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a second. "It's not about you, Ethan. It's about what you represent." She leaned closer, her voice lowering even further. "The Claw don't understand humanity. They think we're weak, insignificant. But they're wrong." Ethan's breath caught. Wrong? The Claw, a race so deadly, so ruthless that they hunted for sport, had underestimated humanity? What kind of threat was he facing here? "They have no idea what they're in for," Ethan muttered, his grip tightening on the branch beside him. It felt like a strange, new power was coursing through him, an adrenaline-fueled realization that he wasn't helpless. Not anymore. Kira's eyes flickered to him, a spark of approval in them, but her expression remained intense. "Exactly. The Claw have underestimated us for centuries, but they've made a grave mistake." She stood slowly, her muscles tensed, ready for whatever came next. "Humanity doesn't bow. Not even to them." The silence between them was thick with anticipation. Ethan felt a fire ignite in his chest. He didn't know what the future held or how he was supposed to fight alien hunters, but he knew one thing: he wasn't running anymore. Not from them. A distant rustle made him snap back to reality. The creatures were close. Too close. Kira raised her hand in a silent command, and without a word, they moved again, weaving through the dense underbrush. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the sounds of their breaths and the distant, growling pursuit. Ethan's heart pounded in his ears, but there was no room for fear. Only survival. Suddenly, a harsh screech split the air, a terrifying, guttural cry that sent shivers down his spine. Kira was already in motion, pulling him into a narrow gap between two massive trees, just as a shadow darted across their path. The Klar didn't just track, they hunted in packs. Their movements were coordinated, precise, like a well-oiled machine, and they didn't miss. Ethan's eyes widened as the closest hunter's glowing eyes swept past them, its sleek body moving with predatory grace. It paused, sniffing the air, and for a heart-stopping moment, Ethan thought it might have detected them. "Don't move," Kira whispered, her voice a deadly calm. The hunter prowled closer, its heavy steps shaking the ground beneath them. Ethan's body tensed, ready to bolt, but Kira's grip on his wrist held him still. Then, in a flash, the creature turned and vanished back into the shadows, moving swiftly into the depths of the forest. Ethan's breath came out in ragged gasps, and he looked at Kira, disbelief still plastered across his face. How did you know?" She gave him a quick, wry smile. "Because they think like we do. And they've made the mistake of assuming that we're easy prey." Ethan didn't have time to respond before Kira pulled him forward again. "We need to keep moving," she said urgently. "The Klar don't give up once they've set their sights on you." A flash of red light caught his eye, and he jerked his head toward the source. There, in the distance, was the unmistakable glow of a Klar scout ship, hovering silently just above the trees. Kira's face hardened, her eyes narrowing. "They've called for reinforcements. We don't have much time." Ethan's mind raced. They had to act, and fast. "Do you have a plan?" he asked, though the question felt almost ridiculous. Kira's smile was sharp, her resolve like steel. "I do now." As they sprinted into the unknown, the weight of their situation was clear. The stakes had just escalated, and Ethan was no longer just running for survival, he was fighting for something far greater than himself. The hunt was on, and humanity's future was in the balance. Ethan's breath came in ragged bursts, his legs aching as they tore through the thick underbrush. The Klar scout ship still hovered in the distance, its red lights flashing ominously, cutting through the night like a warning beacon. Kira's hand gripped his arm, pulling him through the dense trees with a determination that left no room for hesitation. "This way," she murmured, veering left sharply. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried an authority that demanded attention. Ethan followed without question, his senses on high alert. The sounds of the Klar hunters were growing fainter, but the presence of the ship, their reinforcements, loomed closer, a constant reminder of the danger. Kira was quick, moving with an ease that belied the tension in the air. She didn't seem out of breath. She wasn't even shaking. It was as if the chaos around them didn't touch her. Ethan, on the other hand, could feel the weight of every step, his body trembling with the effort to keep up. "How long can we keep this up?" he gasped, his voice strained but sharp. Kira glanced at him, a flash of something in her eyes, a mixture of resolve and something darker. "As long as it takes. The Klar won't stop until they have me." Her voice was steady, but the words sent a chill through Ethan. It wasn't just about survival. This was personal. She stopped abruptly, and Ethan almost collided with her. "Stay low," Kira ordered. She knelt, pulling him down beside her. Ethan's pulse quickened, but he obeyed, sinking to the ground beside her. The forest around them was still, eerily so. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain that hadn't quite reached the ground yet. There was a tension in the air, an electric buzz that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. It wasn't just the Klar that made him nervous. It was Kira. She was hiding something. He didn't know what it was, but there was a story behind her words, a reason for her unshakable resolve. He just didn't know how much of it he could trust. The sound of a heavy footfall snapped him back to reality. His heart leapt into his throat as he saw the shadow of a Clar hunter pass just a few meters ahead. The creature's form was massive, its broad shoulders and sleek, muscular body gliding with unnerving precision. Ethan barely dared to breathe. The Clar's glowing eyes swept over the area, scanning for any sign of movement. Kira's fingers tightened on his arm, and her face was inches from his, her breath soft against his ear. "Don't move," she whispered. "They can sense our heartbeats." Ethan froze. The hunter was close enough now that he could almost feel the pulse of its presence, the cold weight of its gaze brushing over him like a predator's touch. His body betrayed him, every muscle screaming for release, but he stayed still, forcing himself to steady his breath. The hunter's gaze lingered for a moment longer, but then it moved on, unaware of their presence. Ethan exhaled in a rush, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until now. Kira rose slowly, her movements deliberate and cautious. "We need to move. Now." Before Ethan could ask another question, she was already on the move again, her speed and silence unnerving. He followed, doing his best to keep up, his feet stumbling over rocks and roots in the dark. "Where are we going?" he managed to ask, his voice low. "To a safe house," Kira replied, her gaze flickering toward the sky, where the Clar ship continued to hover. "It's an old contact's place. If we're lucky, we can use it to regroup and plan our next move." Ethan's mind was racing. Safe house. Plan. Next move. The words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't help feeling the weight of the uncertainty hanging over them. How could they fight a species so deadly? What could they possibly do against something that had hunted Kira for so long? They kept running, pushing through the trees, their breath mixing with the thick, humid air. Then, without warning, Kira veered off the path and ducked into a thicket of bushes. She motioned for Ethan to follow, and he did, heart in his throat. The branches shifted as they crawled through the thick underbrush, and Ethan realized they were moving toward a small, unmarked clearing. Kira's eyes scanned the area. It was a crude hideout, the sort of place built in haste, no windows, just walls of thick branches and vines woven together to create a rough shelter. The smell of moss and earth permeated the air, and the only sound was the distant hum of the Clar ship above them. "We'll be safe here for now," Kira said, but her voice was tinged with something darker, something more fragile than Ethan had heard before. She seemed to hesitate before adding, "They'll come for us. But this gives us a chance." Ethan's mind raced, his hands shaking as he processed the gravity of the situation. Kira wasn't just running from something. She was running to something, some sort of reckoning that involved both of them. He met her eyes, and for a brief moment, the truth of their situation hit him like a blow to the chest. There was no going back. Whatever Kira had dragged him into, he was in it now, locked into a fight for survival, not just for himself, but for humanity. The Clar had made a mistake by underestimating them. Ethan was beginning to see just how deeply that mistake would cost them all.